And thank you so much for joining today's webinar on the topic of how to win over your international negotiation partners. Thank you so much for all joining. It's great to see we've got a very busy room today, and again, people from all over the world seem to be represented. I won't name nationalities because I'm sure I'll only miss someone out, but it looks as though we have people from all four corners of the world, which is great. My name is Cathy Wellings. I'm the director here at the London School of International Communication. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes some housekeeping before I hand over to Geraldine, our presenter today. Some of you know this already. You've been with us on other webinars. But for those who are new to the webinar platform, just a few things to remind you of. You are all on mute, unfortunately. We would love to hear your voices, but with so many people, we would ask you to contribute via the chat function, which I can see some of you have found. We will do our best to make it interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions, give feedback, share your opinions as we go along. We'll make sure we finish a little bit before the hour to allow time for questions and comments at the end as well. But if something comes to mind, just feel free to pop it into the chat and we'll make sure we answer the questions as we go along as well. Couple of other things. We are recording the webinar and we will circulate that to you in the next couple of days afterwards. So feel free to share that with any colleagues you think might be interested. There are a couple of functions that I would like to share with you on the platform. You may already be familiar. At the very top of your screen, there is a hands up. So Geraldine might ask you some questions that require a yes. So you might just want to give that a try, see if you can put your hand up. The hand. The other thing that we might ask you to do is to annotate the slides. So you should see on the left-hand side of your screen, on the left-hand side of the slideshow, there is a toolbar with a T for text, and there's also a pen. So again, you can write or tick or comment on the slides when Geraldine asks you to. Feel free to have a go if you'd like to, but it's fairly easy to use. So that should be fine when we get to that point. So really, I don't want to take up any more of your time. This is obviously a very important topic to a lot of us, as I think this has probably been the most popular webinar that we've run to date. I think we all negotiate, both in our professional and our personal lives. And it's not always the easiest thing to do. So hopefully Geraldine is going to share with you some of her insights and best practice. Geraldine is a very experienced trainer. She's also an NLP practitioner, but in her previous lifetime, she worked in the insurance sector in a sales and marketing role. So has hands-on experience of negotiating as well as from a trainer perspective. Obviously, we only have a short time with Geraldine this afternoon, so she's going to focus on quite a specific area of negotiating, but also one that I think is very important but gets neglected, which is really around how you get into the mind of the other side, the people you're negotiating with, and how you adapt your usual approach to make sure that you really appeal to the people that you're negotiating with. So I will see you at the end, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the session and I will hand over to Geraldine. So thank you so much, Geraldine. Over to you.
Thank you, Cathy, and hello everyone. Welcome to this short session. I hope that you'll really enjoy it, and it might make you feel inclined to come back and see us again. So from most people's point of view, negotiating is challenging enough when you are of the same mindset, from the same culture, from the same company, maybe when you speak the same language. But there are new challenges that come into play when you're dealing with a different culture, a different organization. And so, although many of the same factors may apply to international negotiation, they're more complex because of that. So what we would like to do today is to share with you a few takeaway ideas that will instantly win over your international negotiating partners and make it easier for you to reach the result that you want. So here are the objectives that we had in mind for this session. Firstly, to help you gain insights into what really matters to your counterpart. Secondly, to adapt your approach to increase the likelihood of agreement. So instead of it feeling like such a push to get to where you need, to make that feel easier. There are some typical pitfalls that lead to early misunderstandings, and it is important that you know what those are and how to avoid them. So we're going to give you some key tips which will help you to tailor your message effectively for negotiating. Now, Kathy mentioned that we have got the hands up thing, and I wanted to find out from you, do you actually enjoy negotiating? So hands up if you absolutely enjoy it and really like it. Okay. Now, hands up for the people who think, oh, not really. Okay, well, that's interesting. So we've got more not reallys than absolutely love negotiating. And of course, something that we don't really love doing can seem more challenging to start with. So I really hope that by the end of today, you've got some ideas that might change you from a not really enjoy negotiating to something that you might prefer to do. So I just want to start by asking you, what matters most to you about negotiating? So I'd like you to look at these points on the slide and tick the 3 that you think most apply to you. Whether it's building a working relationship, not getting into a deadlock, getting the best deal, avoiding cultural upsets, showing expertise. Just please use the pen or text or whichever to annotate the slide and tick 3 that you think are the most important to you. Okay, thank you. So if we look at those, and please carry on ticking if you haven't finished making your selections. If we look at those, we can see that building a working relationship is very popular. Creating a positive impression and minimizing conflict has got lots of ticking going on at the bottom there. And I'm going to come back to these points in a few minutes, and then you'll see why I asked you that question in the first place. Because the reason that we do things is all about action and motivation. And so let's have a look at that. Negotiating is all about getting someone to act. You need the other party to do something to be able to get an outcome. And in the words of Shelley Rose Charvet, when you understand the motivation direction, you will be able to prevent and avoid many problems and reach your goals more effectively. So what does that mean, motivation direction? Let's have a look at it and why it even matters. If you've heard of motivation direction before, this might be familiar, but a lot of people have heard of motivation, but they're not aware of the direction being important. So let's see. Motivation direction is the difference between knowing what you want and moving towards your goals. And you recognize that because people get very enthusiastic. They talk about what they're going to gain, what they'll get, they'll have what we want. It's all about including things. And you'll see them doing lots of nodding and, yes, that's good, that's what we want. And even in cultures where physiology is much more restrained, where they don't do more emphatic body language, you might notice somebody would lean forward when you say something that is of interest or something that's... So when you're talking about achieving what we want, they'll come forward. Apologies for the big face appearing on the screen. And then maybe when you're talking about moving away from problems, talking about things that people don't want, things they want to avoid, the language will all be about exclusions, problems, we don't want that, no, there'll be more head shaking, maybe quizzically head on the side, just more pulling away from you. Now, the reason this really matters is because we often think that in negotiating, we have a goal, we have a purpose, we have something we want to achieve. But very often, to influence the other party, you need to know what they want to avoid. And for that reason, I'm now going to hop back to the slide that I asked you. What was important to you, or what mattered to you about international negotiating? So if we look at building a working relationship, the first one, that's towards a goal of building a working relationship. If we look at the second one, not getting into deadlock, is away from a problem. The focus is there, we don't want deadlock, let's avoid that. And if I look at the most popular ones, let's go right to the bottom, minimizing conflict, that's away from a problem. And that matters a lot to, I can't exactly count all the ticks, but it looks like about 8. So 8 or more of you think that minimizing conflict is something that really matters to you, and that's away from a problem. So if I could actually show you how to negotiate internationally and at the same time minimize conflict, that would sound appealing to you. To some other people, if I said I could show you how to create a positive impression, that might appeal more to you. So our motivation, our reason to act and do something is directly linked not only to what's important to us, but whether that is moving towards something that we want or away from something that we don't want. So I'm just going to go back now to where we were here. If you wanted to put this into a sporting equivalent, the analogy would be that somebody who's focused on towards achieving a goal will tend to be looking for the finishing line. It's where am I going? How am I going to get there? And it's all about the end result. Somebody who is more focused on avoiding problems is a bit more like somebody running a race of hurdles. They can see the hurdles, the things they need to overcome to be able to get to this finish line. Now, when these two different styles meet in a meeting, the people who are looking at the problems and knowing what they want to avoid may experience the way the other side, the people who are all about the goal, they may experience them as just being, oh, too good to be true, it's too easy, you're just focused on the finish line, can't you see all these problems that are getting in the way? Whereas the people who are all focused on the finish line are all going to be thinking, these people are so negative, or they can see problems, they don't really want to get a result, they just see the things that are getting in the way of a result. So these are two very different styles. Neither are wrong, neither are right. One isn't better than the other. They are just the way we think. And the way we think matters to the way we're going to act. So if you want to make it easy to negotiate with an international partner, if you can plug into understanding what matters to them and what will make them act and how you can feed into that, then you will get a much more successful result. And the main thing is they will think you really understand them, because you'll be making a connection on an unconscious level where you actually understand their motivation and what they want to achieve. So I've got some examples here for you. So if you can get your tick box out again, I'd just like to see whether you can recognize in these phrases whether the focus is on achieving a goal or avoiding a problem. So agree with stakeholders. You might like to tick or mark the slide to say which you think that one is. Yep, we're there. So yes, agree with stakeholders is an achieve statement. What about won't make mistakes? Great, you've got it. And present ideas clearly. What about that one? Perfect. Gain rapport. Avoid being late. Now, meet the target. What about reach a compromise? What do you think that one is? Yes, you've nailed that too. Reach a compromise, because it involves achieving, but not necessarily achieving everything that you might have hoped, has a dimension of both. So you can see that although in certain situations and certain phrases, it's very clear what somebody's motivation direction is, in other situations, you can find that it's split between the two styles, and I'll talk to you about how to deal with that in a minute. And then lastly, minimizing conflict. Which one is that? Achieve or avoid? Okay, split decision on that. I would potentially go with avoid, but I can see how you would also see that as an achieve. So the situation here is quite simply that to make somebody recognize that you understand what they mean, you should not translate minimizing conflict into agree with stakeholders. So if somebody says to you, we need to minimize conflict, then you use the language of minimizing conflict. If somebody is talking about agreeing with stakeholders, you do that. But we're going to have a look at some more examples. So here's an example from politics. My government's commitment to create a people-centered society of liberty binds us to the goals of. Now at this point, you could all be forgiven for thinking it was towards achieving goals, until you hear the rest. Freedom from hunger, freedom from deprivation, freedom from ignorance, freedom from suppression, and freedom from fear. That's a quote from Nelson Mandela. So you can see that although he talks about goals, the goals and their motivational direction are all away from problems. And this is something that once you become aware of it, you can see it in everyday conversations. Advertisers use it. You will just start to recognize it as a language pattern that will give you clues on where to best start your discussion and how to link to what matters to the person that you're speaking to. So what happens when you're in a situation looking for motivation direction? You'll often find people might say things like, it's important that we make a difference, or communication is really important to us. And those words are too abstract. You don't really know exactly what the motivation direction is. Excuse me. So you need to start digging. And here are some questions. So what's important about communication? What's important about making a difference? What else? What's in that for you? Tell me more about what communication, tell me more about what growth, tell me more about what control means to you, whatever the angle they happen to be focusing on. And I would always recommend that you ask 3 questions. Sorry, the slides overlap there, but I would really recommend that you ask 3 questions, because the first question may give you a towards a goal, and the next one may give you an away from a problem, just like you saw in that extract from Nelson Mandela. Now, you don't only see these towards and away from in conversations, you won't only experience them in negotiating. You'll also notice that people who sell you products use this motivation direction to attract and plug into their customers' needs. So I've got 5 examples here taken from different products. I just had a quick look on the internet at a few products. So what I'm going to do is read them out to you, because when you see things written down, you process it differently. And I'd like you to experience just hearing and then see whether you can still recognize the motivation direction just from hearing. So there are 5 examples. You can tick either achieve or avoid or both, depending on what you think. So the first one, as sophisticated as it is easy to use, so you won't need to search for a song, just tell your car to do it for you. What do you think? Yes, you have it. In part, it's away from. You won't need to tell your car. You won't need to find a song. Just tell your car what to do. So it is more away from. What about the next one, number 2? More brilliance, more beauty. Definitely. All about the achieve. The next one, connecting customers to opportunities, helping people fulfill their dreams. Number 3. Yes, it's all about achieving. Now here's one for you. Our journey towards good. Number 4. Yes, there is some towards, our journey towards good. So the word towards makes it seem like it's towards. However, journey towards good suggests it comes from not so good. So therefore it could be regarded as being away from bad. And in that situation, you have an element of both. And then the last one I have for you here is taking every terrain in its stride. What do you think of that? Okay, so we've got a couple of marks for achieve and several more for avoid. So yes, every terrain in its stride suggests that it can deal with the good and the bad. Just if you're interested to know where these products come from, this was Volvo, Sony Bravia, HSBC, McDonald's, and Mercedes. So now that you've got an insight into how people use language to plug into your motivation, and in fact how you can plug into other people's motivation, this is something that will make other people feel that you really understand them. So using motivation direction, apply the style and the language that matches the other person's preference rather than your own. And sometimes that's very challenging, because when you realize that they're all away from, they're all avoiding problems, and you're a naturally very optimistic and positive person, it will feel like you're having to really bring your energy down and maybe switch on the negative. Learn to switch quickly. For every achieve, there's an avoid. So be early, avoid being late. Agree, avoid conflict. Understand, avoid confusion. Confident, manage your nerves. Speak clearly, avoid mumbling. Meet expectations, avoid disappointment. There's always an opposite, and when you get into the habit of looking for the opposite, then you'll be easily able to present them when the time comes. If you don't know what somebody's motivation direction is, then the best thing to do is to express the ideas that you want to put across in terms of both achieve and avoid. So one thing is to stop translating problems into goals to make things sound more positive, because if you gloss over the problems, your counterpart may be so stuck in the problem that they're not going to be able to consider agreeing with you. So from here, I'm just going to move on now to another point that deals with the issue of motivation direction. But let's look now at how we can avoid some typical early misunderstandings that arise. And here we have you communicating with your counterpart. And you know exactly what you want to say. You know exactly what the content would be, and you have your goal and your problems. But in between, you sending the message and the receiver receiving it, there are all the complications of different language, different culture, beliefs, values, intuition, any history that you have with that person or that company or this situation of negotiating. And all those things potentially interfere with the message because they take up space in your head. And this is one of the most important factors in understanding, is where is our attention at the time that we're receiving the most important messages. So let's look at the factors that can get in the way and then how we can avoid them. So the three main factors that will affect understanding when we're taking in information from outside are three automatic filters that we have. The first one is delete. The second one is distort, and you can imagine how difficult a distorted wheel makes the cogs of understanding. And then the third one is generalise. We're going to look at each of these in turn and see what the effect of each is and how we can get around it. So first of all, delete. This is a natural filter that helps to control the amount of information going into your brain and just stops you being overloaded. So the first point is the number of pieces of information, the amount of stuff that you can actually expect to present to somebody. As far as bullet points go, if we look here, 7 plus or minus 2, so that's between 5 and 9, and I would always err on the short side of that. And make sure that if you're using slides that you're not using more than 5 bullet points. The volume of information that you give, if it's overfacing for the person, what will happen is they will automatically delete some of it. You won't know what they're deleting. Therefore, the best way for you to manage the input is to control the flow of information to that person so that they can process it and keep the sequence, keep the understanding, and don't miss any of the important points. If you give too many points, then it's almost certain that the person will delete the information. So the second point is speed. Now, I am sometimes known for speaking too quickly, and if that's happening today, then maybe we need to give me an alert in the chat box. But the speed that you give information, particularly when you're dealing with any non-native speaker, thank you for the alert, the speed that you speak at will potentially mean that the person receiving the information will not be able to process it, translate it, and deal with it in their head. So you have to slow down, as you might notice that I've just had to do. The next point is the level of detail. Generally, you want to start with the big picture and go into the detail, and then link back to the big picture. Often, if we plunge straight into the detail, then the person we're trying to communicate with may be unable to make the same connections. Now, we'll deal with this a lot more in the full program, but getting the level of detail right and the transition from the big picture to the detail is crucial. If you don't get the level of detail right, if the speed is too much, and if the amount of information is too much, then the net effect is overwhelm. And I'm sure we all have had an experience at one time or another of how it feels to be completely overwhelmed by information. To be able to understand or even remember some of what's been said. Now we're into distort. So distort is really about keeping things clear. Now, on the positive side of distort, if you wanted to generate ideas, get some creative thinking going, distortion, divergent thinking is a great thing. But as far as negotiation is concerned, you really want to make sure that any distortion is within the scope of the topic that you're covering. So the first thing that you want to focus on is making sure the scope is right. So instead of saying, and another thing, oh, well, maybe we could include this or do this, you don't really want to start bringing in too many extraneous factors unless you're directly able to link them to the topic that you're talking about. So keep the scope tight and work within the framework. If you need to go outside the framework of the discussion or the parameters that you've agreed for a discussion, then it needs to be very clear how you're doing that. Otherwise, the scope for distortion is huge. Precision. Precision is not only about the language that you use, but also being able to make sure that the other person understands exactly precisely where you are. So precision is about making sure that you understand and that the other person understands what's needed, and it involves checking understanding, clarifying, retracking, and going back to make sure that there are no misunderstandings in what you've said. Now this involves slowing things down quite significantly at certain points, but is really, really useful. And to build in a checkpoint at every stage of your international negotiation is really important. When you think you've signed something off, when you think you've agreed a timescale, when you think you've agreed a deadline, just recap and make sure that the person that you're dealing with has exactly the same understanding. A typical misunderstanding and distortion is close of business. I have worked with clients that think close of business is 11 p.m. in their own time zone, never mind anybody else's, and other people think that close of business is 5 or 6 o'clock. So it's really important to understand what people mean when they're talking about times and about boundaries. Now the next section that we're going to talk about really involves you having to maybe do a bit of travelling back in time, because it's about generalising. And I'm going to ask you in a minute to give me some information about, I'm sure if I just said, what is this, that you could all answer that it's a chair. Unless we have some very, very young and bright participants in the audience who are still children, I know that you will all know it's a chair. So the question is, how do you know it's a chair? So there are key words and phrases that are used to define a chair, and what I'd like you to do, if you would please, is to write down for me on here some key words or phrases that you think are essential to defining a chair. Imagine you're talking to somebody who doesn't know what a chair is. They've landed from another planet and you're explaining what a chair is. Okay, so we've got seat. Seat, and you can sit on it. We've got 4 legs, we've got shape for sitting. Sitting down. Okay. Rest. Okay. Relax. Good. Any more? So let's have a look then at how this works on the next. Oh, hang on, somebody put something as I was just going off. Watching TV. Oh, good. Yeah. Okay. Right. A chair is a seat. Now, there's a picture of a seat, but it isn't a chair. So although we know that a chair is a seat, just calling it a seat is not in itself enough detail. So this goes back to, you know, the big picture and the detail. So if we just describe a chair as a seat, we could get a different kind of seat. What else about a chair? I'm just going to flick back again and see if anybody... Ooh. Okay, seat. Okay. I'm going again to my chair. Right, a seat with a back. Now there's a seat with a back because we needed a back because the stool doesn't have a back, but it wasn't the right kind of seat. So a seat with a back, but that still isn't a chair for one person. And is that enough detail now? Well, it is, unless you want to differentiate different types of chair. So why did I get you to do this apparently ridiculous exercise of defining a chair when really that's got not very much to do with international negotiating, and you all know what a chair is? Well, the reason is I'd like to actually show you that when we know what something is so well, we've generalized something for so long and we know so much about it, we forget the detail. We don't need to remember what the rules for being a chair are because we already know it. And when we apply that to negotiating and we generalize, we make an assumption that everybody that's in the room or everybody that's discussing this topic has the same level of knowledge or understanding about a particular topic or about a particular subject. I've seen many examples of this, particularly where you have very senior people involved in negotiation and some more junior people, or where you have a very different culture or organizations that have very different cultures, where there's an assumption about something that is not actually matched well between the two parties. Now, what often happens here is that the person who doesn't know what you mean will not want to necessarily admit it because it may make them feel like they're going to look bad. It may make them feel less equal in the negotiation. So from that point of view, generalizing is an extremely challenging aspect of international negotiating because it puts you at odds with the other person in that you've made an assumption, you've generalized, and the other person doesn't want to admit that they don't know what you mean because it may put them at a disadvantage. The second thing, and more importantly for one of the points that you mentioned earlier, is it often will convey to the other person a lack of empathy, that you don't understand them. Because if you understood, or if you understood their business, then you wouldn't have made an assumption that put them in that position. So in terms of generalizing, it's great to help us categorize, it helps us learn, it's the structure of learning. But what it actually does is it makes the other side have to work hard to understand you. And unfortunately, the other side, that's exactly the opposite of what they need to be doing. The other side need to be able to understand you more easily. That's the whole point of you understanding motivation direction, about you feeding the information in the sorts of sizes of chunks that people can understand, and also being able to be precise in the scope and avoid making assumptions about the knowledge of the other side. That stops the other side having to work so hard for you. So if we recap here, your counterpart will get what they want or what they don't want, and you can help them to achieve that. Make it easy for them to understand you and your message. Keep checking that you're on track, and if necessary, you can retrace your steps. Go back, recap, ask questions, and don't expect the other side to work hard for you to get your desired outcome. What's most important here is that you make them feel like they and you are on the same wavelength without them having to make so much effort. My top 3 tips would be that motivation direction provides the clues that you need to help you negotiate well. By understanding the motivational direction, by being able to switch your own motivational direction to match someone else, you can actually make people feel that you really understand them very, very clearly. To achieve your goals, you need to help other people avoid and resolve their problems. And these are the problems that will potentially prevent you reaching agreement, because sometimes they're the iceberg below the surface. You can see the tip of it, and the tip of it is the goal. But the thing that will prevent everything being agreed is the big problem that never came out because you didn't ask the questions to find out what was behind the need for communication, what's behind the need for collaboration. So learn to switch styles and learn to dig to find out the motivation direction to make sure that you can switch styles and match their need. The way we filter information can result in misunderstandings. Now, this will happen in any culture and in any language, but it's more prone to happen in international negotiations because of the differences, particularly where you have non-native speakers on either side. Take responsibility to minimize the risk in the way you communicate with your counterparts. I had a great analogy explained to me once that broadcasting, which is essentially what I'm doing today, is not communicating, because I'm not able to check back with you that you actually understand and are with me on everything that I'm saying. So if I was communicating with you properly, where I could check your understanding and take full feedback from you, that's real communication, where I am taking responsibility not only for what I'm saying to you, but also for you understanding clearly what I'm saying. Now, 3 of the ways that you can make sure that people will understand you is to minimize their natural tendency to delete. And that you can do that by feeding information in a particular way. When somebody is trying to read something, give them space. Don't keep talking. If you're presenting written information, make sure it's not overcrowded on the page so that you have space to see the chunks of information. Particularly in technical documents, very often the volume of text is overfacing. When you're looking at distortion, yes, it can be great to do a bit of blue sky thinking and to get some creative ideas, but sometimes we need to keep the context very tight. Keep everything within the scope of the discussion, because the more aspects you bring in, the harder it is to agree something. And then lastly, we're talking about generalizing. When you generalize, you're making assumptions, whether you realize it or not. When we talk in generalizations, we make assumptions that people can connect with that level of discussion. Maybe we need to actually have set out the terms of engagement first, and maybe even agree to have a sheet or some document that sets out any generalizations and terminology that you're going to use to make sure that everybody knows what you mean by that. So those are the tips. Now, it would be great if you have any questions that you would like to ask, and if you'd like to feed them through to the chat, then Kathy and I will do our best to make sure that we answer them all for you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. That was fascinating, and it's certainly given me a lot of food for thought. It reminds me of the kind of adage that we talk about a lot in intercultural communication, that we I'm not sure if you know the platinum rule. So it's not about treating others as I would like to be treated, but about treating others as they would like to be treated. And I guess with negotiation, it's about doing it the way that the other side is going to work for, rather than the way I think it's going to work for what I need. Um, so it's really interesting. We do have a few minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat function. I can see some people are typing, so if anything comes to mind, let us know. There's a question just come through from Ria. So how do you ensure that you are keeping to the scope? Don't know what your thoughts are there, Geraldine.
Oh, usually what I would do is when we were at the beginning of the negotiation, when you're trying to establish, if you like, the framework for the negotiation, then we would talk about the scope of the discussion, the scope of the problem, first of all, and then look to the scope of the solution. The scope in some cases might be defined by costs, it could be defined by geography, it could be defined by any number of things, but you start with the things that you can't change and define those, and then within that. So it could be also the scope of who makes decisions, the scope of communication, who needs to be copied in. As far as if you were just having a discussion with one person or negotiating with one person, then another factor that comes in is the level of detail that you would go to. So we will actually cover this in the main program. But for example, if you start to discuss a topic, for example, like a car, you could say, well, a car is a mode of transportation. And a mode of transportation is technology, and technology is energy, and energy is the universe. And by now you've completely lost everybody because you become so abstract in your discussion. And I did that rather too quickly. But you could then talk about parts of a car or types of cars. So what you need to do is to define exactly what level of detail you want to go into on any topic, what the rules of engagement are for the topic, what the parameters are for negotiating with the other party. So scope will cover all of those factors for me.
Does that help, Ria? Great. There's another question which I'm sure is on other people's minds as well from Cecilia, which is how can you find out in advance, I guess, what style the other person has? How can we adapt to their style if we're not sure what it is?
If it's on motivation direction, then if I couldn't find out at all because I'd never met them before, I would quite simply cover both options on anything I was suggesting. So I would be talking about how we can achieve A and avoid B, how we can work towards C and minimize the effect of D in that way. Another thing I might do is just say to them, what is important to you? What's most important to you in the result? Just the same as I did on the slide, what matters to you about international negotiating? And then ask, and then say, and what else? And what's important about that? And eventually, if you've asked at least 3 or 4 questions, you will start to uncover what they mean, and it's after that that the problems will start to creep out. They don't often creep out in the beginning.
So by asking some good questions up front, we're more likely to get a sense of the style of the other person if we haven't met them before. Great.
And if you don't know, it's not the end of the world. You just cover both options.
One other question that we were talking about before, Geraldine, which might be worth just touching on again, was around these, particularly the motivation direction, and whether one can map those against cultural norms, cultural types. And I think we felt both that it's very difficult to generalize, as always, when it comes to cultural preferences with these things. It might be worth just expanding a little bit.
Well, you could, I mean, you will get people who will generalize. For example, if I take the US versus the British example, which is quite a common one,
sure,
that you ask somebody in the US, how are you today? And they'll say, great. fantastic. And they seem very upbeat and very enthusiastic. And very often when you ask a British person how they are, they'll say, oh, not bad, mustn't grumble, which will seem much more subdued and much more negative. So you could, just by looking at that, deduce that the people in the US are more towards and more achieve, and the people in the UK aren't. However, it isn't really quite that simple, because behind every achieve may be a couple of avoids, but they may be lower down below the surface. So I would avoid and achieve and avoid. To achieve understanding, you need to avoid pigeonholing somebody and deciding that they are a type, because it's very rare that somebody follows true to type, and particularly when you mix with lots of different nationalities and you work in lots of different types of organisations that have their own culture, the type is less likely to follow true.
Sure. And I think you also said, correct me if I'm wrong, that any individual might lean more towards both preferences depending on the context.
Definitely. So, for example, if you're going out to buy a sandwich for lunch, then you may not be too fussed about whether it's achieve or avoid. If it was to buy a car, or to buy a house, or the bigger the purchase, the more factors will come into the decision. So there will be certain things that you will want in a house, there will be certain things that you absolutely won't want. In a negotiation, there will be certain things you're prepared to give, and there will be certain things that you categorically cannot agree to do. So there will always be an achieve and avoid in everything.
Sure. Thank you. We have a few more minutes if anyone has any last questions. Otherwise, we'll start to bring things to a close. It looks like the questions are done for now. So let me just raise your awareness of a couple of events that we have coming your way soon. Geraldine mentioned we are running a full programme on this topic of how to negotiate internationally across cultures. And that's taking place here in London on Friday the 28th of October, so towards the end of this month. And obviously then Geraldine goes into a lot more detail about all the elements of how to negotiate across cultures and to really get into the mindset of your counterpart. Oleg, sorry, I've just seen your question. We will be sending a follow-up email in the next 24 hours, and that will include the recording, so you will receive that in the next day or so. And the other thing I just want to draw your attention to is our last webinar for this year already is taking place next month, early next month, on the 8th of November. And that is on the topic of virtual teams, focusing very much on the early stages of virtual teams and how you can actually build that dream team and get things off to a strong start when you're working on virtual projects and initiatives. And then just finally, our social media channels. So do feel free to follow us on Twitter or Facebook or whichever your poison is. If you have any questions that you haven't been able to ask now, contact me, contact Pfizer if you know her, and we'll be happy to forward them on to Geraldine. And otherwise, thank you again so much for joining, and do stay in touch. We hope to see you either online or face-to-face in the coming weeks and months. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.